911 AD. The Seine is thick with morning mist. A fleet of longships sits grounded in the shallows, silent, motionless, heavy with the weight of 100 years of raids. For a century, these vessels were the most feared hardware in the known world. Fast, shallow drafted, built to appear from nowhere and vanish before the morning was done. They had terrorized coastlines from the British Isles to the Mediterranean. But on this particular morning, something different happens. The man standing at the prow, a Viking chieftain the Franks called Rollo, does not give the order to sail. He steps off the boat, he walks to the riverbank, and he kneels. In a single gesture, he trades the open horizon for a fixed piece of soil. This was the Treaty of Saint-Clair-sur-Epte, and it was not a surrender, it was a calculation. Rollo received the territory that would become Normandy, the land of the Northmen, in exchange for one thing: protection of the Frankish coast from other Viking raids. He was now officially a duke. A pirate had just become a landowner, and the implications would take centuries to fully unfold. To understand what the Normans became, you have to understand what they were made of. When Rollo's people settled in Frankish territory, they were not a unified ethnic group. They were raiders from the Norse world, Scandinavian, pagan, oral. Their identity was built around movement. Permanence was foreign to them. Within 2 generations, that changed entirely. The Normans absorbed Frankish wives, Frankish customs, and the Catholic Church. Genetic studies of medieval Norman remains trace the collision in bone and tooth enamel. The Scandinavian haplogroup I1 and R1b, -U106 markers, common in Norway and Sweden, fused with the R1b-P312 lineages of the Gallo-Roman locals who had been there since before the Roman conquest. This was not a replacement. It was a biological merger, and it produced something neither group had been on its own. The physical toughness, the maritime instinct, the aggressive expansion of the Norse world, grafted onto the administrative tradition, the Latin literacy, and the political sophistication of Frankish culture. The result was a people uniquely suited to conquest, not just by force, by design. Normandy was never a destination, it was a staging ground. From the stone keeps they built across the Seine Valley, the Normans looked in every direction at once: north toward England, south toward the Mediterranean, east toward the crumbling edges of the old Carolingian order. What had been violent and chaotic in the Viking world was now organized, disciplined, structured around land, inheritance, and military obligation. The pirate had become the architect. The raid had become a campaign. The longship had been replaced by the castle. Geography was their destiny, and they had just found the perfect launch pad. But the Normans were not merely absorbing a new homeland. They were engineering one. The castle was their first instrument, not the grand stone fortresses that came later, but the motte and bailey, a wooden tower on a raised mound, surrounded by an enclosed courtyard. Simple, fast to build, impossible to ignore on the horizon. Within 20 years of settling in Normandy, these structures had transformed the landscape. Every strategic river crossing, every hilltop with a sightline, every road junction marked by a Norman tower. The message was architectural. This land has an owner, and the owner is watching. This was not the Viking way. Vikings raided and moved. The Normans stayed and built. Each castle was a statement of permanence, a declaration that the new order had arrived and intended to remain. The knight who rode from that tower was also something new. The Normans perfected the heavy cavalry charge, armored men on war horses, moving in formation, trained to break infantry lines with momentum alone. It was a weapons system that had not existed in the Viking world. It required land, horses, investment, and years of training. It required, in short, exactly the kind of settled, hierarchical, resource-rich society the Normans were in the process of building. The pirate had become an institution, and institutions, unlike pirates, do not disappear when the wind changes. By the mid-11th century, the Normans had outgrown their borders, not militarily, politically. They had built an administrative hunger that Normandy alone could no longer feed, so they moved in two directions simultaneously: north toward England, where a disputed throne sat waiting; south toward Sicily, where Arab emirs and Byzantine governors were struggling to hold what they had. This was not random expansion. It was the deployment of a system. Wherever the Normans arrived, they did not simply occupy territory. They restructured it. They replaced local power arrangements with a vertical hierarchy of their own design, one that extracted taxes, organized armies, and recorded everything. On October 14, 1066, the Norman cavalry shattered the Anglo-Saxon shield wall at the Battle of Hastings. By nightfall, King Harold was dead. Within 3 months, William of Normandy had been crowned King of England in Westminster Abbey. But the real innovation came years later, and it was not a battle. It was a book. In 1085, William commissioned something that had never been attempted at this scale. He wanted to know exactly what England was worth. Every hide of land, every plow team, every fishery, mill, and orchard, every serf, every freeman, and every lord, and what each of them owed the crown. The resulting survey filled 2 volumes and covered over 13,000 settlements across England. It was called the Domesday Book. Think about what this was: a government survey so granular that no lord in England could overstate his holdings or understate his obligations. It made evasion structurally impossible. It ended the era of tribal land claims. It replaced custom with record. And it inaugurated the age of the centralized state, a model that would spread across Europe and eventually the world. While England was being mapped, Sicily was being reimagined. The Hauteville family, a Norman dynasty from a small village in Lower Normandy, had carved out a kingdom at the center of the Mediterranean world. By 1130, Roger II ruled a court that had no equivalent anywhere in Europe. At his table sat Arab mathematicians, Greek Orthodox clergy, Jewish merchants, and Norman knights. Official documents were written in 4 languages: Latin, Greek, Arabic, and Old Norman. His fleet was commanded by an admiral, a word the Normans borrowed directly from the Arabic Amir al-Bahr, meaning ruler of the sea. It was Roger II who commissioned the geographer al-Idrisi to produce the Tabula Rogeriana, the most accurate map of the known world produced in the medieval period. Al-Idrisi spent 15 years on it. The result was made at Norman request by an Arab scholar in a Greek-speaking city on a Sicilian island. That is the Norman achievement in a single document. Roger's court built the Palatine Chapel in Palermo, a building that still stands today. Walk inside and you are standing inside a medieval argument for pluralism. Latin floor plan, Byzantine gold mosaics covering every surface, Islamic muqarnas ceilings above your head, 3 separate traditions, 1 building, 1 commissioner. The Normans were not interested in religious purity. They were interested in civilizational efficiency. Whatever worked, they used. Whatever produced beauty, power, or revenue, they absorbed it into their system. Back in England, the Norman conquest produced something that was never intended: a class system written into the vocabulary of daily life. The people who worked the land spoke Old English. The people who owned the land spoke Old Norman. The result was a split that you can still hear today. The animals in the field kept their Old English names: cow, pig, sheep. But the moment those animals reached the Norman table, they became something else: bœuf, pork, mouton, beef, pork, mutton. Roughly 30% of modern English vocabulary is Norman French. Every time an English speaker says justice, court, army, castle, or government, they are speaking the language of an 11th century pirate who decided not to sail. The Normans understood something that most medieval rulers did not. Power is not just what you can take, it is what you can record. The Domesday Book was proof of this principle in its purest form, but it was not the only proof. Across England, the Normans built a system of royal courts that operated independently of local custom. Disputes over land, inheritance, and debt were removed from the hands of local lords and placed before royal judges who traveled circuits across the country. This was the beginning of English common law, not a set of rules written down in a single document, but a living body of decisions, precedents that accumulated over generations. Each judgment added to the record. Each record became binding on future cases. It was, in essence, the same principle as the Domesday Book applied to justice. Record everything. Make the record authoritative. Use the record to govern. The Normans did not invent law, but they invented the idea that law should be consistent, portable, and independent of whoever happened to hold power in a given place at a given moment. That idea outlasted every Norman dynasty. It crossed the Atlantic with English settlers. It became the foundation of legal systems governing billions of people today. And it began in the courts of Norman England, in the hands of clerks and judges who understood that the pen, properly wielded, was a more durable instrument of power than the sword. By the 13th century, the Normans had pulled off something almost impossible to explain. They had conquered half of Western Europe. They had built kingdoms in England, Sicily, southern Italy, and the Levant. They had produced the most sophisticated administrative systems their age had ever seen. And then, they vanished. Not by collapse, not by defeat, by diffusion. In England, within 4 generations of 1066, the ruling class was calling itself English. In Sicily, the Hauteville were indistinguishable in culture and custom from the Mediterranean world they had absorbed. In Ireland, Norman settlers married into Gaelic families and, within a century, were described by one English observer as being more Irish than the Irish themselves. The Norman did not disappear. He became the foundational structure of the societies he entered. This is what separates the Normans from almost every other conquering culture in history. Most conquerors leave a visible mark, a monument, a dynasty name, a language that survives. The Normans left something harder to see and harder to remove. They embedded themselves in the operating logic of institutions. You can see the Norman fingerprint most clearly in what they built and in what they changed about how we build. When the Normans first arrived in France, they constructed in the heavy Romanesque style. Thick stone walls, small, rounded arches, buildings that felt like fortresses because they essentially were. But by the 12th century, builders began experimenting with the ribbed vault and the pointed arch, structural innovations that transferred weight down through thin stone ribs rather than thick walls. Suddenly, walls could be opened up, light could come in, buildings could climb. This was the birth of Gothic architecture. The cathedrals they built were not just places of worship. They were political statements made in stone, meant to communicate the power of the church, and through the church, the power of the Norman lords who funded them. Height was authority. Light was divine endorsement. Walk into the financial district of London or Lower Manhattan, and you are looking at the same argument, translated into glass, steel, and reinforced concrete. The building as power statement, the skyline as claim. The legal system that governs over a third of the world's population today traces a direct line back to the Norman synthesis. Common law, the foundation of legal systems in the UK, the United States, Canada, Australia, India, and dozens of other countries emerged from the collision between Anglo-Saxon custom and Norman administrative logic in 12th century England. They were not visionaries in the romantic sense. They were engineers of systems. They saw that control over information, who owned what, who owed what, who had the right to what, was more durable than control by force. Force wears out. Records persist. The story of the Normans is not a story about a single battle, or a single king, or a single century. It is a story about what happens when a group of people decides that identity is not a fixed thing to be defended. It is a process to be managed. When they stopped asking, "Who are we?" and started asking, "What does this place need us to become?" From a fleet of grounded longships on a misty river in 911 to the court of a multilingual king in 12th century Sicily to the legal frameworks that govern billions of people today, the line did not break. It changed. And in changing, it found everything it was looking for. The Normans never disappeared. They became the world they walked into. There is a word that appears in English legal documents from the 12th century onward, verdict. It comes from the Old Norman veredit, true saying. The moment a jury speaks its finding, it is literally performing an act invented in Norman England. This is what makes the Norman legacy so strange and so total. It is not visible in the way that Roman ruins are visible, or Viking longships in a museum. It is audible. It is structural. It lives in the systems we use to organize collective life. The Norman administrative layer sits beneath the surface of the modern West like a geological stratum. You cannot see it directly, but when you drill down into the language of law, the architecture of governance, the design of financial institutions, you find it there, running through everything. They were not the last empire, but they may have been the most efficient one. They achieved what no other conquering culture achieved before or since. They made themselves disappear so completely into the cultures they conquered that those cultures cannot now imagine themselves without the Norman contribution. England without Norman French is not England. The common law without Norman administrative genius is not the common law. The Gothic cathedral without Norman patronage is a Romanesque fortress that never learned to reach for the sky. The Normans built the modern West and then dissolved into it. That is not a failure of identity. That is the ultimate expression of it. From the long ships on the Seine to the courtrooms of the world, the line never broke. It changed. And in that change, it found its future.